Well, thanks to that video and Naomi, I was already a little nervous before, but now my palms are sweaty because I hate sharks. That's actually my biggest fear, and luckily I didn't write anything like that down because I would hate to have been picked. But well done, Naomi. Proud of you. And yeah, I'm glad it wasn't me. So we're talking today about experiences, all right? And so you know that feeling when you do something super exciting and you need to convince people, okay? So you start, and you're like, man, you got to do it. It's amazing. You got to try it, and this happened, and I felt like this, and you start talking super fast, and then you just they're looking at you like, a bit like you guys are looking at me now, and then you realize, actually, some things just can't be explained, and in fact, you just have to experience it yourself. You've all experienced that before? Yeah. Do you know, like, you could go for a hike to the top of a mountain. I hiked Mount Taranaki, and it took us 9 hours to get to the top. When I got to the top, it was the most amazing view, and it was worth it, and it was so cool, and I tried to take photos and explain it to people, but it just wasn't the same. Or, you know that feeling when you catch an amazing wave and you surf the whole way along the beach, and you have this feeling and you just can't explain it to people. Or maybe it's when you taste that amazing spice or a great dessert and you try and explain just how good it was. Maybe it's the feeling of being on a motorbike and you're cruising along and you have this rush of wind and you just feel free and like you're fearless and invincible all in one, and you try and explain it to someone and they're just like, cool, bro. And that's about it. You know, there's times when you go visit a country and you have all these stories and all these exciting things happen, and you're like, you guys just have to experience, you just have to. And then it's just not the same because they just have to experience it themselves. You might know all the facts. Maybe you've read a book. Maybe you've done all your research and you know everything there is to know about this thing. But until you do it yourself, you just don't know how good it could possibly be. So, if you're joining us today, we hope that you've already experienced something awesome. And if it's your first time, we're so glad that you're here. And if you come back every week, we're even more glad that you're here and that you've come back. So we're starting off this brand new series. You might have heard about it this week, or as they've mentioned today, it's all about coming and seeing. And we don't want to teach you something in the next 4 weeks. We actually want you to experience something like Naomi did then. We want you to experience something that's not just a whole lot of theory or whatever, but something that you can actually practically put into your life and something that's going to be beneficial for you. So we've broken it down really easy, and we've made it that there's going to be 4 C's in the next 4 weeks. So today I'm going to share with you the first C, but before I do, I'm going to explain to you why it's important. So there's this verse, and it's found in Colossians, and Colossians is one of the books of the Bible. So the Bible is actually made up of all these different parts. It's made up of stories and letters and recordings of things that happened, and it's actually compiled 66 books just into one book. Okay, so there's this letter in Colossians, and it's written by this guy named Paul. So Paul writes this letter, and he actually founded a church in Colossae. So he writes this letter to the church because he hears that they're having some troubles. So he hears that they're starting to argue amongst themselves and have disagreements about how they should treat each other, and he's not so happy about it because it was going great a few years before. So he decides to write them a letter. And in the letter, he wants to give them a couple of guidelines of how they should live. So he says, and he starts off with some instruction, and he says, hey guys, be wise. And that's the beginning, and everyone could probably be like, all right, fair enough, we should be wise. That's all good. Who doesn't want to be wise? But then he goes and continues, and he says, hey, be wise in the way that you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. So it all sounded good with be wise, but in the way you act towards outsiders, when I heard that, I was thinking, oh, that's a bit not the greatest to say outsiders. I don't think that's a nice thing to say. It actually could be kind of offensive. But what Paul was actually trying to say wasn't so offensive at all. He was just simply saying, you need to be wise in the way that you talk to people who don't believe the same as you or agree with you, or who are often made to feel like outsiders by people in the church. Because remember, he's writing a letter to the church. So he's asking them to be wise in the way that he speaks towards outsiders. And I'm sure all of us can relate to feeling like an outsider. I know that I have before when I've gone to a new city or started a new job and you feel like a little bit awkward, like everyone knows an inside joke and you don't. And Paul knew exactly how this felt. See, Paul, the guy who's writing the letter, he actually used to be persecuting Christians, he used to be killing Christians and doing crazy, outrageous stuff, and everybody hated him for it. And then one day he had this amazing turn of events where he had a whole change of heart, and he actually himself wanted to become a Christ follower and one of the Christians. So he sort of changed his whole heart, but people already didn't trust him, and actually they were afraid of him because he'd spent his whole life so far doing the complete opposite of what he now wanted to do. So they made him feel like an outsider. So while he was writing this letter, he knew exactly how it felt and the issues that was going on and the tensions in this church. So Paul said to them, hey guys, listen, church, it's simple. I hear what you've been getting up to and I'm not happy about it. It's not right. And he says, don't think that you're so good or so great or above anyone else. Don't think that you're better than them because you think a certain way. He says, you need to be careful and be wise how you treat these outsiders. So he goes and unpacks these instructions, and so far it's all good. He says, be wise, that's great. We can all do that a little bit more. But then he says who we should be wise to, and that's when it gets kind of tricky, and it does in our lives today too, because if someone doesn't look the same as us, if they don't think the same as us, if they don't believe the same thing, it can often cause a little bit of friction or tension, and it's hard to just, accept them. But he's saying, hey, you need to be wise to those people too. And he doesn't stop there. He then goes one step further and adds on to his instruction, and he says, hey, not only do you need to be wise to them, you also need to make the most of every single opportunity you have with anyone who's an outsider. So Paul is just hitting it straight, and he says, not only do you need to make the most of each opportunity, but you need to be intentional about the way you treat them, the time you spend with them, and how you make them feel. So far, Paul has given some good instruction, but he doesn't finish it there, and he then gives the key thing to his instruction. And Paul says in the next verse down, let your conversation be full of grace and salt. And when I read that, I'm thinking, that's so cool, Everyone needs grace. Grace is something that continually gives. Grace is something that, we don't have any acceptance without it. And then you think of salt, Salt is such a good thing to experience. You put it on your food, it makes everything taste better than before. It brings out flavors, and it always adds to the meal. So Paul's asking us as well to be that kind of person to people. But actually, if we read it this way, we miss the whole point of that verse, because the most important thing is actually let your conversation be full of grace and salt. He's not even focusing on the others. They come after the conversation. That's the key thing. So being wise was one thing. The way we treat outsiders was another. To be intentional about making the most of the opportunity, but then let your conversation be full of those things. You with me? Great. So the conversations are the most important things, but what is conversation? It can be different to all of us, so I Googled it, as you do, and this is what it came up with. It said, conversation is a two-way communication. It's different than just talking. It's talking with someone. You're not talking at them, it's talking with them. And it's a journey that is continual. Conversation has ups and downs and can sometimes be super messy. It includes listening and seeking to learn and understand, which is, I think, vital. But most importantly, conversation, and I hope that by the end of this talk we can all remember this, conversation is something that causes connection. So conversations cause connection. If you want to have any healthy relationship, you know that this is the most important thing. Any relationship you have, it's not going to be any good without communication and conversations. All relationships are based on it. You have some conversations in relationships that are super loud and intense, some that are really high-pitched, or some that are in amongst a whole lot of crying that nobody understands, some that's really funny, some that's sweet, and some you just wish you weren't in it at all. But everyone can relate. Relationships need communication. Communication comes from conversation, and that equals connection. So If we understand this so well, and we all do it with our friends, our spouses, our kids, our family member, or our boss, or whatever, that's how we have connection. But how come when it comes to, like Paul is explaining, our connection with outsiders, how come we find it so hard? Wouldn't it be simple just to use the same way we connect and have conversations with anyone else? Why is it so hard for us to have conversations with someone who maybe just doesn't believe the same or think the same or look the same as us? You know, a lot of people, they think that they are having these conversations, and the people that Paul was writing to in this letter, they thought that they were doing it, but they weren't having conversations. They were having conversion attempts, or they were having confrontation attempts, and they were telling everyone, you know, what they're doing wrong and how they should be living. And they weren't just having conversations just for the sake of having a conversation to build connection. They always had a hidden agenda behind it. And it can be super hard to have conversations like this, especially with a random or someone we really don't agree with. But luckily, there was someone who had the right approach. And this person was actually the king of conversations. And this was Jesus. So there's actually so much we can learn from the way he interacted with all kinds of people. Every single time we see him interacting with someone, it's founded on conversation. There's Zacchaeus, the tax collector, the crippled beggar, the 10 lepers, the disciples. Every single time he is connecting with someone, he's having conversation. In fact, there's a quote, and it's by Daryl Davis, and it's he's actually saying, he's done his research, and he says that out of 132 contacts that Jesus had with people, he recorded in the New Testament, which is the second half of the Bible, 6 were in temples, 4 were in the synagogue, and 122 were in the main streets. So that's quite an impressive thing, because so 132, they'd written down and they'd seen that he's been connecting with people. And in that, only 6 were in the temples, 4 were in the synagogue, and 122 in the main streets. So what does that tell us? Who's outside the synagogues and outside the temples? Outsiders. And that's exactly where Jesus was. His approach was just to be with them, just to hang with them and connect with them. He didn't judge them or only hang with the people inside those places. He was just out in the streets where people were doing daily life, just to have connection with them. One of these stories in the Bible that we can see where he's connecting with someone was a story where Jesus actually has a conversation with this woman at the well. So you can find it in a part in the Bible called John, and he records the whole story. And it's actually so cool, because Jesus is having this conversation with this Samaritan woman. And in the story, we don't know her name, we don't know how old she is, we don't know anything about her except she's a Samaritan woman, and it's recorded that Jesus had the longest one-on-one conversation with her. So it's pretty impressive. And the conversation went like this. So it was Jesus, and he was traveling with his disciples, and they were going between one place to another, and somewhere along the journey, he got super tired, or they decided to take a break. So he sits down by this well, and he says to his disciples, hey guys, you guys go in and get me some food and get some supplies or whatever you need for the rest of our journey, and I'll just wait here. So while he's waiting there, a lady comes along with this clay jar to collect water. So this well is the only water source for the whole town. So a lot of people would be coming there, but it is hot in the middle of the day, and so she comes to draw her water, and Jesus is sitting there, and he just says to her, hey, excuse me, could you please get me a drink of water as well? And she just stops and stares at him. And I think it was good. He used his manners. It's not a big deal, just asking for a glass of water. But she was shocked, and she said, excuse me, you know I'm a Samaritan, she reminded him, and you're asking me for a drink of water? And to understand that, you need to know a little bit about it. But actually, Jesus was a Jew, and he wasn't allowed to speak to Samaritans, because Samaritans were the outsiders. Also, men weren't supposed to speak to women unless their husbands were present. And Jesus was also a rabbi, and rabbis were definitely not supposed to speak to women or anyone who looked kind of dodgy or shady. And this is what this lady looks like. So she's shocked, and she's like, how dare you ask me for a drink? She's like looking around. She was nervous and probably thinking, man, people are looking at me. They're going to judge me. because this is against the law, and I'm chatting with this guy, and she started, thinking about all the possibilities that could go wrong. But Jesus just focused on her, and he just simply wanted a conversation. It's actually important because, Jesus wanted just to have conversation that would form a connection. But she was worried about the judgment she would get, and that judgment would mean she would be even further separation from not only Jesus, who she was chatting with, but anyone else as well. So, she is stressed about this judgment causing separation, and she doesn't even want to continue the conversation. But Jesus is casual as. He's not even worried about that. And he keeps going with his conversation, and she's asking, if you ask me for a drink of water, but yet you don't even have a cup or anything, what are you even doing sitting by this well? How are you thinking you were going to get water down there? I think she had a bit of a cheek asking something like that, but she was curious, and she their conversation went on a little bit more, and during their conversation, she had she disagreed with him, and she's like, I don't know how I feel about that, and I doubt this, or I disbelieve this, and their conversation went on, and then in that conversation, Jesus is smart, and he doesn't miss a beat. He not only he takes it from asking the drink of water, but then he's like, man, if only you knew the gift of God. And he offered her so much more than she could offer him with this glass of water. He went on and talked about this living water that he could give her, and if only she experienced it, it would be so much better than anything she'd ever thought of, and in fact, it would change her whole life. He didn't just sit at the well and be like, hey, how's it going? Can I have a drink of water? How about that weather? He actually took the time to go full in depth in that conversation and offer her this amazing experience that she would never get from anywhere else. He put into the conversation the grace. He accepted her as she was, and he also offered the salt and added to what she was already doing. Imagine if we had conversations like that with complete randoms that we found, even if it wasn't the norm and people would judge us for chatting to them. When I was 11, I was in an athletics club. You probably wouldn't guess that now, but I actually ran track and field and was pretty fast. And I used to go all the time to these athletics days and do all different things. And there was this girl in the athletics club who was from another school, and we always got placed in the same group, and we'd have chats and not much else, but we'd sort of just talk only about athletics. And then I never entered any competitions when I'd be going to church on the weekend, and she'd be like, hey, where were you the other week? And I'd be like, oh, just hanging out. I wouldn't actually tell her why. And then the next year, she was in my class at school, and I was like, oh no, she's going to figure it out. And we sort of hung out a little bit. We played more sports together, and we'd catch up every now and then. And she said, hey, what are you up to this weekend? And I was like, I was actually getting baptized that weekend. So I didn't want to tell her, but I was like, I've just got this thing, my thing, and it's cool. And she's like, what? And then I was like, okay, here goes. And I was like, I'm actually getting baptized at my church. And she's like, you go to church? And I'm like, yep. And then she's like, what's getting baptized? And I was like, oh, here we go. I'm losing another friend. But I unpacked it all, and I said to her, well, yeah, I go to church. That's why I haven't been at athletics on the weekend. And I'm getting baptized because, I want to tell people about, God. And she's like, you never told me about it. And I was like, oh, the complete opposite of what you're supposed to say. But I was only 13, so give me grace. But I told her about it, and I was like, oh, cool, we'll see how it goes on Monday. But she actually turned up to my church that weekend, and she came to my baptism. And I was so mind-blown, and I was like, wow, this is embarrassing as. And luckily we didn't have smartphones then, so no one could put anything on social media, and none of my other friends could find out. But from that day, we sort of chatted about it, and she didn't get it at all. She thought it was kind of weird, but actually now, 17 years later, me and her are actually best friends, and she herself has been baptized, and she takes her 4 kids to church every weekend. So it's pretty awesome. And I'm not telling you that because some cool thing that I did or whatever, but because a small conversation God used to do something huge and awesome, which is so cool, and now it's even affecting the next generation. So imagine how Jesus, he just had this conversation with this random lady. I just said this random blurt out about going to church. Imagine what could happen with you having an intentional conversation with somebody like that. So this week, I want to challenge you guys to, and myself, I want to challenge us to think how we can have an intentional conversation like Jesus had with this random lady and like he's recorded having so many times in the Bible. I wanted you to think about where you find yourself, where you're surrounded by somebody that you could chat to. So it could be when you're dropping the kids at school, maybe you speak to the teacher or you speak to another parent who's waiting to pick them up, or maybe the gate monitor, maybe it's the person who makes your coffee every day, maybe someone at the gym or in your office or next to you on the bus. Wherever you find yourself, look for those little opportunities that you can actually have a chat with someone and make sure that you don't miss what could be an amazing conversation. You might think, that's cool, but you're definitely not going to do it. You're just nodding now to be polite. And I understand that because it's actually super hard. I hate talking to just randoms. And this week we had Spirituality Week at Massey, and a whole bunch of us went there, and we had to spend the entire time talking to strangers. So they'd be like, why are you guys here? And then we'd explain and unpack it. And it's actually like super hard. It didn't come easy. And this week, so recently I've just moved into a new flat. And 6 weeks ago, I got a new flatmate. And 4 of those 6 weeks, I've been away. So our relationship is on top form. We pass each other every now and then because I'm hardly ever home. And she goes to work super early while I'm still asleep. So it's a great relationship. And she said to me last week, hey, should we catch up and hang out and have dinner next week? And I was like, yeah, cool, that sounds awesome. And for some crazy reason, I then blurted out, and you should bring your boyfriend too. And I was like, oh, great. So I was like, oh, well, it's next week. And then next week came, and it was Thursday this week. She's like, we're still on for dinner tonight? And I was like, yeah, cool. She's like, cool, her boyfriend's coming too. And I was like, great. And then I was thinking, okay, maybe I should fake a sickie and text her, except we live in the same house, so then I'll have to spend the whole night in my room. Maybe I should tell her something came up at work. I even told everyone else at work that I was so nervous about it and stuff. And anyway, it came, and I was like thinking in my head, okay, I'll put on a movie, and then we don't actually talk much, and then we can eat while the movie's on, and it'll all be over, and it'll be great. Except we didn't put on a movie, and she came, her boyfriend came, we chatted for like 3 hours, and they're the most nicest people I've ever met, and I'm so lucky to be living with one of them. And they also signed up for our soccer tournament in 2 weeks, which is next month, which is super cool. So from me being so anxious and nervous just to have conversation with them and just avoiding her in the kitchen every day for the last 2 weeks, she's actually such a cool person. And conversations I know can be scary, and I'm challenging you guys to do it too, but the coolest things can come out of it, and it can be completely worth it. So I hope that this week you guys can do something brave like that as well, like talk to your flatmate. And maybe you think, you know what, I have no idea where to start on that kind of thing, and neither did I. But the coolest thing is that Jesus, he offered the perfect example for us. And when he was speaking to the woman at the well, he gave us some examples. So one was, allow time in your schedule to not be so rushed. So when you are going about your busy day, Jesus, he was going from one place to another. He wasn't even there yet, and he probably had to get there before it's dark, but he sat down by the well. He could have sat under a tree on the side of the road, but he sat in the place where everyone would be going to get water that day. And he just allowed time to have a chat with this person. He positioned himself well because he could have sat anywhere, but he sat right there where he could have conversations with everyone. So I wonder, how do you guys position yourself throughout the week? When you get to work, do you get there just when it starts and you leave as soon as it finished, or at uni? Or do you sort of hang around and have chats to people, see how their weeks was? Do you allow time to stop at lunch, or do you just eat at your desk? How do you position yourself to be able to have conversations with people? Next thing is just do something small. It can be easy, like just smiling at someone or offering to help with something, carry the groceries or put the trolley back at the supermarket. Maybe it's even opening the door for somebody. The last thing that Jesus did was he found common ground. So 1 minute he's just talking about a drink of water. The next, this lady's whole life is being changed. And he just found common ground with sitting at the well. And I wonder how you can find common ground with people you find yourself hanging out with, you know. Maybe they're also wearing a sports jumper that you love and you can talk about sports, or you actually work in the same building or live in the same house, so you already have common ground. But just think about, how you can start off a conversation with something small with these people. You never know the impact and the connections that can be made. See, at Gracegate, our heart is actually that every single one of us is having conversations every day with a complete stranger or a complete random, but someone that you come into contact with, that I can't come into contact with, or neither can anyone else here but you. And imagine if we didn't judge them at all, meaning more separation, but we just purely had conversations with them, connected with them just because, and we broke down any walls so there wasn't the insiders and outsiders like the church in Colossians was dealing with. Imagine if we ourselves got to experience some awesome connections and relationships that we wouldn't just tell people, oh yeah, it's really cool, you should try it, but they got to experience it too, and that friendships were formed and our whole community started this ripple effect of connecting with each other. If you haven't been going to Gracegate for long, you probably haven't yet heard of our awesome vision, this plan and this awesome idea we have that it's called just walk across the room or just move across the room. And it's this whole concept of, if you just take time to step outside of your comfort zone, and if you just take a moment to get out of your daily routine and allow time to have conversations with people, imagine what could happen. And we want to challenge you guys to do that and to intentionally do it, to not miss an opportunity like Paul speaks about. Imagine if every single one of us did that with just one person this week, there would be doubled in our community. What happens on a regular basis would be doubled, and there would be lonely people feeling included and connected, and there would be those who felt like outsiders breaking down walls and barriers and just feeling included and part of the team. Jesus wants us to have conversations with him. And not only does he want us to have conversations with him, but he wants us to have conversations with people that he absolutely loves. And that is every single person on this earth. So he would love it if we didn't just talk about, we should maybe one day speak to our neighbor who lives right next to our house. But he would love it if we had conversations with them that built connections and that formed a relationship and where you could just help someone with no agenda. No matter what you have done, no matter who you are, no matter what you believe or don't believe, you can have these conversations that could change somebody's life. He wants relationship with you, and he wants you to have relationship with others. I can't explain to you how awesome it is to have a relationship with God and how great it is to experience this unconditional love and this grace that brings seasoned with salt to it. You just have to simply experience it for yourself. In this whole series, we're speaking about come and see. And we really hope that you guys come and see for yourself how just having a conversation can cause such a connection that changes people's lives. It's an amazing thing, and each week we don't want to just teach you about it. I want you to now go and experience it for yourself and put it into part of your daily life, that you just end up talking with people and having conversations everywhere you go. So, last thing for us is, to wrap it up, is to be wise. Be wise when you're in the way that you connect with outsiders. Be wise towards anyone you meet, and making the most of every opportunity. So wherever you find yourself, even if you're just sitting next to someone on the bus, maybe instead of being on your phone, just be like, hey, how's it going? What are you up to? Just have a conversation. Just be intentional about it, and then let your conversation full of grace and full of salt. And let your conversation be intentional, that it leads to a connection as well. And imagine if all of us did that, there'd be one exciting place to be. So this week, that's your challenge. And now I'd just like to pray for you. God, thank you so much for that reminder that Paul gave us that's just as relevant for us today. That we just ask that you help us to be able to be wise in the way we treat outsiders, that we break down any walls that make an us and them and an insider and outsider thing, Lord. Help us to be able to be intentional about making the most of every opportunity we have to have a conversation that can go deeper than just how's the weather, but really how are you, and form a connection and change people's lives just through relationship. Lord, I pray that you help us to be able to experience it for ourselves and encourage others to experience it too, so that we can have the ripple effect in our community. So God, we just ask that you help us to put that into practice this week. Help us to have open eyes to be able to see who we can connect with and who you've put into our day for a reason. And we ask that you bless us through the rest of the weekend as well. Amen.